Hello, Rams, and welcome to another episode of Rams History. And with this episode, we are going to begin our look at an extremely complex historical event, the French Revolution. I'm going to break it up into bite-sized pieces and make it a little bit easier to comprehend. So today's episode is going to be about France before the Revolution, which was known as the Old Regime. Now, France prior to the Revolution was made up of three social classes known as estates, and the quality of life you enjoyed largely depended upon which estate you lived in. The first estate were known as the clergy, of course. These were all of the officials of the Catholic Church. The second estate, of course, were the nobility, and there were actually two types of nobles. There were the sword nobles. These was the ancient nobility of France. And then, of course, there were the robe nobles. Now, these were nobles who had purchased their titles from the king. This was something the king did as a means of raising funds, but there was some tension between the sword nobles and robe nobles. And finally, of course, there was the third estate, which essentially comprised everyone else and made up about 97% of France's population. It's kind of difficult to really characterize the third estate because it was a very varied group. You had peasants, of course, but you also had the bourgeoisie, the urban middle class, and the third estate ranged from extremely poor people who were essentially homeless all the way up to very successful members of the bourgeoisie who were actually quite wealthy and in many cases wealthier than many nobles. Now, being a member of the first and second estate meant that you enjoyed some very significant perks. First of all, of course, they controlled all of the power, both the religious power and the political power. And as a result of that, both of these estates enjoyed some very nice things. For example, tax exemptions. The clergy and the nobility really paid very little in the way of taxes. There were also other types of perks, for example, hunting. In France, hunting was forbidden to members of the third estate. It was something reserved strictly for the nobility. You may ask what the big deal is, but keep in mind if you're a peasant who's hungry, you simply cannot hunt for game because that is something that nobles reserve for sport. So the first estate and the second estate are enjoying some very nice perks and have a much better quality of life than the typical French peasant. Now, on the other hand, members of the third estate had to endure some very significant burdens. For example, there was what was known as corvée. This was essentially labor that had to be provided to the local lord or the local nobility. This labor was unpaid and it had to be done by the peasantry. There was also a tax known as the taille, and this was due on the peasants. Indeed, the Third Estate paid the vast majority of all the taxes in pre-revolutionary France, and there were taxes on other things too, such as salt. Finally, there was the tithe. This was 10% of your income, which was expected to be given to the church. And this could take various forms. It could be a cash payment, it could be part of your harvest. But still, for a hardworking peasantry that was just trying to get by, that was a significant chunk of your income taken by the first estate. Now, other things were really starting to impact the third estate as well, among them rising prices. In the 1780s, there had actually been a series of bad harvests. Now, I know we all try to be conscious today about our carbs, but before the Revolution, the French consumed large quantities of bread. In fact, the French are still quite fond of their bread today. And in the years prior to the Revolution, poor harvests had been causing the price of bread to rise dramatically. This especially hit the urban poor in the cities, such as Paris, quite hard. So all in all, ladies and gentlemen, the third estate in pre-revolutionary France is bearing a tremendous burden. They're 97% of the population. They're paying the most taxes. They're being hit by inflation very hard. And the first and second estates are really living very nice lives, enjoying a lot of perks and paying very few taxes in the process. Now, at the moment France is reaching a crisis, it unfortunately has a very weak and indecisive king. Louis XVI will be taking the throne in the 1780s. He takes the throne as a very young man. He's only about 15 years old when he becomes king. But he was rather weak, rather indecisive, certainly not much to look at. He was a little bit chubby and overweight. And in fact, someone described him as being something of a schlub. So unfortunately, right at the moment France requires very strong leadership, Louis XVI will not be the person to provide it. He certainly was not the man his grandfather, Louis XIV, was. Now, adding to this explosive mixture was his Austrian wife, Marie Antoinette. Now, you have to keep in mind that France and Austria had been enemies for a very long time, and their political union was something of a recent event, and many French still regarded Austria with hostility. So Marie Antoinette is a Habsburg, actually, and she comes to France to sort of cement this political union. She was quite beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. Everyone who saw her remarked upon how beautiful she was. And she comes to France as a very young 14-year-old girl. She really doesn't know very much about the country. Her French is very weak, and she's going to really stir up a great deal of controversy during her time as queen. Now, everyone likes to think that Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." Now, the truth is that, of course, she did not actually say that. Marie Antoinette was the victim of what today we would probably call fake news. There were a lot of pamphlets known as libelles, which were being spread around France, and they had a great deal of fun at her expense. For example, she was the Austrian woman, la femme autrichienne. A chien is also a female dog in French, and so the French often enjoyed doing a bit of a play on words. Marie Antoinette was referred to as l'Autrichienne, essentially in so many words, the Austrian bitch. And she was also accused of a lot of frivolity. She was accused of having multiple affairs and of being sexually very open. And she was also accused, of course, of other sort of rather infamous behaviors. Unfortunately, what happens, of course, is a lot of people believe this kind of news, and it really poisoned many of the French people against Marie Antoinette. Now, in addition, she had a bit of a reputation for lavish spending. In fact, another nickname given to her was Madame Deficit. She enjoyed gambling, she enjoyed fine things, and lavish hairstyles, and nice clothing. And of course, the libelles would often magnify her habits far worse than they actually were. And so Marie Antoinette is going to cost the monarchy a great deal of popular support. So at the moment, France is really sort of reaching a political crisis. The monarchy is suffering from a very extreme loss of sort of moral character. The king is weak and indecisive. He's not popular with the French people, and his Austrian wife is regarded with outright hostility. So this is going to sort of add to France's problems in the time before the revolution. Now, France's real problem, ladies and gentlemen, is economic. The French budget in the 1780s was reaching a crisis. As you can see from this chart, nearly 50% of France's income was actually going to service the debt. And then, of course, there was another extreme amount going to the military. Notice, too, that about 6% of the income, or about 6 cents out of every dollar, was going to support the nobles at Versailles. And what that meant was that the money left over for every other program, such as helping the poor and running France, public works, and things like that, was only about 19% of the budget. So the French are sort of reaching a crisis here. Their debt is increasing, it's eating up more and more of the budget, and right at a moment when public services are most needed, the ability of the French government to pay for them is running quite thin. So eventually, the king's finance ministers convince him to call what becomes known as the Assembly of Notables. Basically, what the belief is that it's time to reform the tax system. We have to start making some changes. We have to make sort of that 3% pay their fair share, as they might say today. So this Assembly of Notables is called in 1787, and of course it is hoped that they will agree to some reforms to help France increase its revenue and sort of bring this financial crisis to a swift resolution. Unfortunately, however, the Assembly of Notables, which was made up of high-ranking clergy and nobility, really had nothing to do with this. This political cartoon from the time period sort of really reflects the will of the assembly. You have this creature, kind of looks like a baboon, saying, "Dear objects of my care, I have assembled you to ascertain with what sauce you want to be eaten." And of course, you notice the birds respond, "We don't want to be eaten at all." So essentially, the Assembly of Notables rejects most of these proposed reforms. They simply reject this concept of paying more taxes. And in fact, the Assembly of Notables essentially says that these questions need to be given to the Estates General. So the Assembly of Notables really accomplishes very little, and France's financial problems continue to worsen. So finally, King Louis is forced to call the Estates General. This was essentially a legislative body that in fact had not been called in a very long time. Louis XIV and his successor Louis XV had effectively governed without it. So when this Estates General is called, it's going to be assembled for the first time in a while, and it's going to be an assembly which comes with a great deal of grievances. In fact, the members of the assembly would come to the meeting at Versailles with what were known as cahiers, and these were lists of complaints from the people within their districts. This assembly is going to be the beginnings of the French Revolution, but of course, no one can foresee that. Right now, it just seems as this meeting will be called to try to resolve some financial issues. Now, what many people, of course, had not anticipated was sort of the simmering resentment of the Third Estate. And Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès really sort of summed this up. He had a pamphlet that went out, and he essentially asked, what is the Third Estate? He said, basically, it's everything. The Third Estate is France. It's 97% of the people. What has it been until now? Well, it's been nothing. The Third Estate has been largely ignored. And what does it want to be? Well, it wants to be something. All right, the time has come for the Third Estate to really stand up and be recognized. Things have changed, ladies and gentlemen. The Enlightenment has swept across Europe, and even though France has largely been resistant to some of these Enlightenment concepts, many Enlightenment figures, such as Voltaire, had come from France. And although most French monarchs could not be accused of being enlightened monarchs, these Enlightenment ideals had nonetheless permeated into French culture and French society. So the time has come for a change, and when the Estates General is called, the First and Second Estates are going to learn to their dismay that the Third Estate now demands to be something, and the Estates General will witness the very beginnings of the French Revolution. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that sums up this quick look at the old regime. I do hope you have enjoyed your time here at Rams History. And as always, if you enjoy your time here, please like and subscribe. And we'll see you again soon with part 2 of the French Revolution.